Learners who have signed up for this class will gain hands-on experience with the processing and the analysis of SAR data in the framework of Jupyter Notebooks. Today I want to talk to you a little bit about what these Jupyter Notebooks are and why they have gained such popularity in the sciences over the last few years. I also want to talk to you about how you interact with these Jupyter Notebooks in order to complete all the exercises that are related to this class. So Jupyter Notebooks have a lot of benefits for education and training, partly and especially when it comes to SAR. You see an example of a Jupyter Notebook here on the right-hand side. This is actually one of the notebooks we'll be using in this class. Notebooks provide a data recipe composed of executable code mixed with instructions and graphics. So in contrast to a description of a workflow that you may have in a Word document or in a PDF, here the workflow includes embedded executable code so that you can fully reproduce the examples shown in the data recipe, and you have a full executable and reproducible experience. The notebooks that we are developing, they're fully based on public domain resources, so it's easy for you to share your notebook with other people and expand the notebook upon beyond what it's currently doing. And if you're completely new to Python programming, the notebook is a really vanilla entry into the field of programming because it already has a lot of existing code in it, which allows you to get used to the syntax and used to the concept of programming. Let's have a look at one of these notebooks to understand what all of its different components are and how you walk through all the interactive content contained in one of these notebooks. So here you see an example of a Jupyter notebook. This is one of the notebooks we will be actually using in one of the exercises. When you look through this notebook, it looks like a Word document or a PDF document visualized in a web browser. So here I'm using Chrome, but these notebooks are web browser agnostic and will work in any of the web browsers you might be using. Notebooks are composed of a sequence of individual so-called cells. As you see here, this blue frame, this is one of these cells. If I click to the next one, you see there's a second cell that's showing up. And in the notebooks that we'll be using for this class, we'll be using a sequence of two kinds of cells. We have the cells that contain text and graphics and explanations. So they show up with a blue mark on the side. These cells are so-called markdown cells. Markdown is very simplified formatting language for text. It's similar to HTML or LaTeX. So markdown code, markdown cells, these are the cells that contain text. If you wanted to create additional cells in a notebook like this, you could just click on Insert, and you could say Insert a cell below. Whenever you insert a new cell, it will default initially to the second type of cells, which is code cells. So these code cells contain a specific kind of computer code, and what kind of code they have to contain is described a little bit here on the right-hand side. This particular notebook is a so-called Python 3 notebook, so it understands and can execute computer code written in Python 3. So if you wanted to instead create a markdown cell, you can change the connotation of this cell to markdown by simply picking the markdown option from this dropdown. So now you can type your text. You can say like, this is my markdown cell. And then you can, to format this cell, you have to run the cell. You can run the cell in two ways. You can either click the run button. So if you run the cell, it will format or sort of render this cell based on its content. If you double click the cell, it opens up again in sort of the markdown format. Another way of running the cell is through through keyboard usage. If you don't want to click buttons all the time, you can use different keyboard shortcuts. Which shortcuts are available, you can find out by clicking on this little keyboard symbol. And so this shows you which kind of shortcuts are available through different keystrokes. There is some simple formatting you can do in one of these markdown cells. You can create a heading. You do that by starting a line with a hash, a mark, and a space. And then when you execute that code cell, it will render this particular code cell as a first level heading. If you want to do a second level heading, you can just do 2 hash marks, and it will render this code cell as a second order heading. You can include lists. So if you wanted to simply create a bulleted list, you can just start the line with a hyphen, and then sort of list 1 hyphen list 2. And if you execute a code cell, it will render those as a bulleted list. So there's some simple manipulations you can do. If you want to know more about how to format a text using Markdown, simple Google search will give you that information. Also, Markdown cells have the benefit that they understand HTML, they understand LaTeX. So if you wanted to add a LaTeX equation, A equals B, and then you render the code, it will format this piece of the code as a LaTeX equation. So these are these Markdown cells. And so in this case, you can click on all of those if you want to know a bit more about how they designed. This is a more complicated one where we are actually mixing Markdown language with HTML code to create a rendered impression that looks professional and nice. So if you wanted to build a notebook yourself, there's some examples on how you embed graphics, how you embed links, and so on. If you go forward, you see that there are also code cells. So here's a code cell embedded. When you execute or run through a notebook, it is important to keep in mind that these code cells in the notebooks have to be run sequentially, because typically the way these notebooks work is that you declare certain variables in one code cell, and you might be using that variable or a function that you developed in a future code cell. So please run these code cells in order. And again, you can run them by highlighting them and then either clicking on the run button, or the way I did it by using a keyboard shortcut. So we will be running through this notebook step by step. So I'm not going to tell you right now what the individual cells are doing, but this is how you execute and walk through the notebook, is by reading the text, and then for every code cell, run the code cell to execute the code that's contained. I hope this information showed you how useful Jupyter Notebooks can be, not only for this particular class, but for your research in general.